Snow drifted in lazy spirals across Portland's harbor, turning the city into a pale blur through the windows of the cab. Nora Quinn sat in the back seat, her hands knotted together in her lap. The skin along her knuckles was cracked from steam burns and dish soap, the faint scent of coffee grounds clinging to her sweater no matter how many times she washed it. She told herself she wasn't afraid, that the decision was already made, that the surgery was necessary, that her life would go on afterward. Simpler, maybe even lighter. But when the cab pulled up to Harborview Surgical Center, her stomach pitched as if she were about to step into a storm. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and overbrewed tea from the waiting room urn. A nurse guided her down the hall, her shoes squeaking against polished linoleum. Nora had asked, begged really, for a female doctor. It felt like the one thing she could control. But when the door opened, she froze. Dr. Miles Bennett looked too young to be what the chart said. His white coat hung neatly from broad shoulders, his dark hair just unruly enough to seem real. She had read his name before in an article about surgical innovation, paired with words like millionaire and entrepreneur. None of that made him less of a stranger, less of a man standing at the edge of her fear. Her breath caught, sharp in her throat. She wanted to turn, to run back into the hall and vanish among the humming machines and hurried footsteps. Nora stood at the edge of the bed, her hospital gown loose at the shoulders, paper wristbands scratching against her skin. The nurse had stepped out, leaving her alone with him. Dr. Bennett didn't speak at first. He didn't glance at the chart or check his watch, as if to remind her how little time there was. Instead, he pulled a chair close and sat, his movements unhurried. "You don't have to talk," he said quietly, as if afraid of startling her. "I'll stay until you fall asleep. Nothing more." Nora lowered herself onto the bed, the sheets stiff and too white. Her pulse thudded loud in her ears. She wanted to say something sharp, to insist she didn't need comfort, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was simpler. She was tired. Tired of working double shifts, of smiling at customers who didn't see her, of pretending she wasn't scared of this moment. Her hands fidgeted in her lap. Miles noticed the cracks in her skin, the faint burn marks along her palms, signs of a life lived in steam and grind. He didn't ask about them. He only reached for the clipboard on the table and scribbled something on the corner of a card. Without handing it to her, he set it gently beside the pillow. "This is not about what you're losing," the note read, in a steady hand. "It's about what you've carried." For a long moment Nora just stared at it, the letters blurring. Something inside her chest cracked open, something she had sealed shut years ago when tears became a luxury she couldn't afford. Her throat tightened, and before she could stop herself, tears welled, spilling hot onto the sheets. Miles didn't move closer, didn't try to wipe them away. He only remained in the chair, presence steady, as if guarding her silence. The anesthesiologist entered softly, adjusting the drip. Nora's breath came shallow now, the world tilting at its edges. Still, she turned once more toward the card. Her vision clouded, but the words glowed clear. For the first time in years, she let herself cry openly, safe, unseen except by him. And as the darkness folded in, she felt not abandoned, but held. The world returned in fragments. A beep, the low murmur of wheels on polished floor, the faint sting of antiseptic in her nose. Nora blinked, but the ceiling above her was still blurred, pale lights smearing into one another. Her throat ached with dryness. She tried to move her hands, but they felt heavy, as though filled with sand. "You're in recovery," a nurse's voice said gently. "Everything went well." Nora nodded faintly, unable to summon words. Her body felt both foreign and emptied, a quiet cavern where something once had lived. She closed her eyes. When she woke again, it was evening. The window blinds in the small room leaked a wash of amber light across the floor. On the chair in the corner sat Miles Bennett, his white coat draped over the backrest. He wasn't reading charts this time, but an old paperback, its spine bent and soft from use. The sight startled her. Why was he here? Surgeons didn't linger. They swept in with technical words, checked vitals, and disappeared into the next case. Yet he remained utterly at ease, as if his only task was waiting. Nora shifted slightly. The rustle of sheets made him glance up. Their eyes met. He didn't smile, but the small acknowledgement was enough. "You'll be discharged tomorrow," he said quietly, closing the book with one hand. "If you need someone to walk you out, I'll be here." She swallowed, throat raw, unable to respond. He didn't press, only nodded once, and after a pause, set the paper back on the windowsill before leaving the room in silence. Morning brought rain. The nurse fussed gently with papers, prescriptions, and aftercare instructions, her cheerful voice filling the sterile room. Nora signed where she was told, dressed slowly, and clutched her worn jacket around her shoulders. At the entrance, he was waiting, not in his coat this time, but in a dark sweater, casual enough to make him look younger, almost ordinary. He held no clipboard, no authority in his hands, only car keys. The ride was wordless. He drove along the harbor, the wipers brushing away rain in steady rhythm. Nora sat with her forehead against the cool glass, watching the gray water shift under the sky. For once, the silence between two people didn't demand to be filled. When he stopped in front of her apartment building, a faded brick structure with a crooked iron railing, he didn't offer to walk her in. He only waited until she opened the door, stepped out, and fumbled with her keys. The engine idled softly. She turned once, almost shyly. He raised a hand in a quiet gesture, then stayed until her apartment light flickered on. Only then did his car pull away. The next day, Nora returned to Harborview not as a patient but to bring something small. A glass jar of loose herbal tea, wrapped in brown paper and string. She pressed it into the nurse's hands with a faint smile. "It's a mix," she murmured. "Lavender chamomile. Helps with sleep." The nurse thanked her, warmth in her eyes. Nora left quickly, embarrassed by her own gesture. That evening, when she returned to her apartment after another weary shift, she found something waiting at the front desk. A small parcel, plain, with no sender. Inside was a tin of lavender chamomile tea, her exact blend, the same label she bought from the market. Tucked beneath it lay a note on hospital stationery. Just 2 words, written in the same hand as the card left before surgery. "For when you forget yourself," and signed. But she knew. Nora stood in the dim hallway, the parcel pressed against her chest. For years, kindness had been a language spoken around her but never to her. Now, in these quiet gestures, his waiting presence, his silence, the tea she hadn't expected, something inside her began to thaw. She didn't call him, didn't write back. But that night, for the first time since childhood, she brewed herself a cup, inhaling steam that smelled of lavender fields and calm. And as she sat by her window, listening to the soft hum of rain on glass, she allowed herself to believe, just barely, that she had been seen. The rumor began, as such things always did, with a grainy image. A security camera in the hospital parking lot caught a slant of rain, the shine of asphalt, and a moment, barely 5 seconds, of Miles Bennett steadying a pale woman as she lowered herself into the passenger seat of his car. No sound, no context, just the tilt of his head toward hers, the way his hand brushed her elbow as she leaned heavily on him. Within hours, the image surfaced on Main Med T, a gossip account that thrived on whispers and innuendo. The caption was cruelly simple: "Millionaire surgeon with patient?" Or something more. By morning, it had been reposted across feeds, threaded with speculation. A man of his stature, alone with a vulnerable patient. The optics were wrong, deliberately sharpened to cut. At first, Nora didn't see it. She was back at work behind the counter of the cafe, the hiss of the espresso machine drowning her thoughts. Customers came and went, a blur of raincoats and umbrellas. Then her phone buzzed, a message from a coworker. "Is this you?" The image loaded slowly, her own tired face staring back from a screen. Her stomach turned. The board called an emergency session. Donors began to circle like vultures, their voices urgent and righteous. "Distance yourself, or we reconsider our support." Among them was Clara Whitfield, Miles's former fiancée, whose foundation carried millions in annual funding. She didn't bother to hide her disdain. "This is not about truth," she told the board. "It's about perception. And perception is everything." Behind closed doors, words like inappropriate, boundaries, compromised judgment floated in the air. Miles sat through it silently, jaw tight, hands clasped. He had built devices that saved thousands of women from invasive surgeries, had funded clinics across 3 states, but all of that balanced now on a single photograph of a gesture misread. For Nora, the fallout was merciless. Her name surfaced online within hours. An address, a shift schedule, fragments of her life ripped from context and thrown to strangers. "She's a gold digger. Typical, goes in for free care, walks out with a rich doctor. Check her background. Bet there's more." The cafe's phone rang off the hook. Customers whispered when she handed them lattes. One evening, she returned home to find a scrap of paper shoved under her door. "We know what you are." That night, she packed a single duffel bag. Her text to him was brief. "I won't be the reason you lose everything. Thank you for seeing me." No signature. No explanation. Only silence after. When Miles knocked on her apartment door 3 days later, no one answered. The super let him in with a shrug, muttering something about rent left unpaid. The space was stripped of her presence. Closet bare, counter empty, the faint scent of lavender still lingering in the air. But on the table, propped against the window where rain traced its endless patterns, lay a single sheet of paper. A sketch. Pencil lines, delicate but steady. It was him, sitting at her bedside, book in hand, head bent in quiet patience. The detail caught him. The crease in his sleeve, the faint line of fatigue under his eyes, drawn with a tenderness that undid him. Miles sank into the empty chair, the sketch trembling slightly in his hands. For all his precision in surgery, all his brilliance in design, he realized he had been powerless in the one place it mattered most, keeping her safe. And in the silence of that small apartment, the choice began to take shape. By the following week, his resignation letter was on the board's desk. They argued, begged, even threatened. He listened, then stood, and walked away. 2 months later, the harbor filled with the sound of grinding metal and welding torches. Word spread of a ferry purchased under his name, an old vessel once used to shuttle tourists across Casco Bay. Neighbors watched as it was stripped, rebuilt, painted white with soft blue trim. When asked what he was doing, he answered simply, "Building a clinic for the women who have nowhere else to go." Harbor Hope, the painted letters read, glinting against the sun. He didn't know if she would ever see it, or if she'd believe it mattered. But in the quiet hours, when he walked the empty deck, he carried her sketch folded in his wallet, worn at the edges. A reminder, not of loss, but of what had once been entrusted to him. The fragile courage of someone who had nothing left to give, and still trusted him to sit beside her until she slept. And that was enough to keep building. The ferry was no longer a ferry. Painted in soft white and sea glass blue, it gleamed under the pale light of a Maine morning. Strings of pennants fluttered from the railings, caught in the salt wind. Across the bow, in navy letters, the name curved proudly, Harbor Hope. Crowds had gathered along the dock. Patients, nurses, volunteers, journalists with microphones angled forward. Children leaned against the ropes, their parents whispering about free care, about second chances. For most, this was the first time they had ever seen a clinic built not of brick but of waves. At the center of the deck, Miles Bennett stood behind a modest podium. He wore no white coat now, only a dark suit with salt still clinging faintly to the hem, as though he had worked until dawn finishing some last detail. The murmur quieted as he began. "Wholeness," he said simply, his voice steady over the gulls. "We often think of it as something we must find inside ourselves. But wholeness is not isolation. It is what we hold for each other." He reached into his pocket and lifted a small pendant, silver, shaped into open hands. It glimmered in the light. "This is not a ring," he said. "It's a reminder that healing is not something we owe only to ourselves, but something we offer. Harbor Hope exists for that reason, to carry what has been too heavy for too long. The crowd applauded softly, respectfully. Some clapped through tears. Miles let the pendant fall back against his palm. His gaze drifted, for a fraction of a second, to the far end of the deck where the doors to the clinic's interior stood closed. He didn't expect anything, had trained himself not to, but still, part of him waited. Then the doors opened, and she was there. Nora Quinn stepped into the light, the sea wind catching the loose strands of her hair. She wore no uniform now, no apron stained with coffee grounds, only a simple dress the color of dusk. In her hands she carried nothing but herself, yet the silence that fell across the crowd was complete. Her eyes met his. Neither spoke. She crossed the deck slowly, each step fragile and certain at once, until she stood before him. For a heartbeat, the world held still, the water, the crowd, the gulls suspended mid-cry. And then she reached for him. Their embrace was quiet, not dramatic. No kiss, no declarations. Only the press of two bodies that had once lost each other and had now, impossibly, found the courage to stay. The crowd erupted, but their silence remained intact, a space carved only for them. The year that followed was not a miracle but something steadier. Nora became Harbor Hope's support group coordinator. She led circles of women in the clinic's small sunlit room, her voice quiet but firm, guiding them through grief, resilience, beginnings. Patients trusted her not because of credentials, but because she had lived what she spoke. Miles worked the medical side, alternating between surgeries in coastal towns and long nights drafting plans for expansion. He stopped appearing in glossy magazines. Instead, he was seen carrying boxes of supplies, bent over charts, or sitting on the ferry's upper deck with children who brought him seashells as payment for bandages. One spring evening, Nora returned from the shelter where she once volunteered. In her arms was a little girl with dark, watchful eyes, abandoned, nearly lost to the system. Within months, she was theirs, Nora's and Miles's. A family stitched not by blood but by choice. The tabloids, relentless as tide, tried again to stir scandal. But this time they failed. Miles's lawyer released the unedited parking lot footage from that night months ago. A surgeon helping a weak patient into a car, nothing more. The story collapsed on itself. Retractions came quietly, too late to undo the harm, but enough to prove what mattered. By then, though, neither Miles nor Nora cared for headlines. Their lives had already left the page. On warm evenings, their daughter fell asleep to the sound of the ferry's hull brushing the dock. On colder nights, Nora brewed lavender chamomile tea, steam curling against the window while Miles read aloud from the same worn paperback he had once held at her bedside. They never spoke of saving each other. That wasn't what had happened. What they shared was simpler, harder, more real. They had chosen to stay. And sometimes, in the hush between words, that was more than enough. 1 year later, the ferry no longer smelled of paint and sawdust. It smelled of salt, tea, and the faint trace of lavender that Nora insisted on brewing for every new group. The upper deck of Harbor Hope had been transformed into a circle of mismatched chairs, donated from schools, church basements, even a shuttered library. Here, women gathered with stories folded deep in their chests. Some spoke in whispers, some not at all. Nora sat with them, never leading from above, only beside. "Take your time," she would say, her voice low but steady. "There's no clock here." They trusted her not because of her training, but because of her scars. She knew the weight of shame that came with being spoken about instead of listened to. She had lived it, and slowly, through her patience, they began to unfold. Downstairs, Miles moved among charts and equipment, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hair unkempt from the sea air. He was no longer the surgeon photographed in magazines with gleaming instruments and venture capital headlines. Here, he was the man who carried boxes, checked stitches, adjusted bandages, who stooped to let a child place a shell in his palm as payment. Between them, life had reshaped itself into something quieter, truer. The child came on a gray afternoon, carried into the ferry's clinic by a social worker with tired eyes. She was small, almost too quiet, her dark hair falling into her face. Her name was Lena. Nora recognized her instantly, from the shelter where she had once volunteered before her own surgery, before everything had changed. The same girl who used to sit in the corner, sketching tiny flowers on scraps of paper no one thought worth saving. When the paperwork cleared, Lena's drawings began to appear taped along the walls of their small apartment above the dock. Butterflies, fairies, people holding hands, worlds in pencil lines, fragile and sure. At night, Miles read aloud from the same battered book he had once held at Nora's bedside. Lena curled against Nora's shoulder, listening until sleep pulled her under. Family, stitched together not by blood, but by the simple, radical choice to stay. The tabloids didn't go quietly. They tried again, publishing her name, dragging out the old photograph of Rain in a parking lot, replaying the narrative of impropriety. But this time, Miles's lawyer released the full security footage, clear and steady. A surgeon helping a weak patient into a car, stepping back, nothing more. The board issued a statement. Donors withdrew their threats. And in small type, below the fold, the tabloids printed retractions. For once, truth had outlasted spectacle. Nora read none of it. She was on the ferry that day, organizing chairs for group, her daughter's laughter carrying from the deck. When Miles handed her the folded newspaper, she only shook her head and said, "Let it go." So he did. In the evenings, when the harbor was quiet and the water held the last light of dusk, Nora would stand at the rail with Lena tucked close, watching gulls wheel against the sky. Miles would join them, a mug of chamomile tea in his hands, the pendant of open hands catching faint glimmers from the setting sun. They didn't speak of healing anymore. That word felt too fragile, too finite. What they had was something less polished, more enduring presence. A choice made daily to hold space for each other, to remain when leaving would have been simpler. It was not a story of being fixed. It was a story of two people, scarred, stubborn, imperfect, who had looked at each other through the noise of the world and said, without words, "I'm not going anywhere." And in the hush that followed, a family had taken root.